Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Friday, February 23rd, 2018. And finally, we are seeing some informed, critical debate about the narrative called Russiagate. At The Intercept, James Risen has faced off against Glenn Greenwald in a lengthy video commentary. And at The Nation magazine, Bob Dreyfus supports the Russiagate narrative with some interesting new evidence and speculation. And Aaron Maté, who appeared with me on a podcast earlier this week right here, continues to offer skeptical views. And this is so healthy, because one of my big criticisms and one of the things that has driven my own skepticism over the last year and a half is the way the corporate media has fallen in line. And only voices who support the narrative are permitted to speak. And it reaches a real critical state over at MSDNC, where we don't see anybody who has any honorable questions, including Glenn Greenwald, who used to be a fairly frequent contributor to Rachel Maddow's show, is now persona non grata. So it's been out for a couple of days now, but in the show file for today's podcast, I've put in a link so that you can go to The Intercept and find the video podcast, and it's refereed by Jeremy Scahill, who is in New York with Risen, and on the video link from Brazil, where it's apparently pretty warm. It's, toward the end of summer there. Glenn Greenwald was perspiring at points, but I think it was really healthy to air this out. And I have no criticism of The Intercept for presenting contrasting, competing, or conflicting views. That is good journalism. And what I learned from the exchange between Risen and Greenwald made excellent points. He belabored it and went on for quite a while. But James Risen's first column for The Intercept was headlined, "Is Donald Trump a Traitor?" And, of course, it's a loaded question that Risen doesn't actually answer in the first of what is promised as a 4-part series. But it's really important. And Greenwald, for whatever faults you might find in him, and they're visible, he is a stickler for the law. That's his background. He's an attorney. And so he cites the definition of treason, which only applies during wartime and is defined in the United States Constitution. Not in a statute. It's not a dictionary reference. And Risen acknowledges that we don't have evidence of treason, and so far you can describe Trump as a traitor. But as David K. Johnston pointed out in our in-depth interview, which I posted yesterday, Trump is a man who is loyal only to himself. He does not give a shit about the nation, about the people, about the Constitution. And so defining him or describing him or suggesting at this point that he is a traitor, I think it's just inflammatory. And Risen basically just kept peppering Greenwald with the same question. Do you admit that Russia meddled in the election? And Greenwald did give some ground on that, to my consternation, because he said, well, the indictment of the Internet Research Agency and 13 Russians does, show that there was some intention. And then he went into a lot of caveats about how, well, is it a crime if the Russians brought dirt on Hillary Clinton to that Trump Tower meeting with Don Trump Jr.? And I think that's a valid question. But to me, the bottom line here, what is important, is that these differences are being aired out, and the public is able to access different points of view on the Russiagate scandal and the media narrative that it has produced. So at The Nation, a magazine that I have supported since the 1970s, I give them credit. They've been publishing Aaron Maté. They've been publishing critical comments from Professor Stephen Cohen. And they also have been publishing articles that support the arc of the Russiagate narrative by my old friend Bob Dreyfus. I've known Bob for over 10 years, He was kind enough to put me up at his house one time on a visit to Washington, D.C., and I got to know him a little bit. He is a solid reporter. He is quite impressed with, and I think buys into, the official narrative, and he has since it was launched with the quirky and sketchy intelligence assessment on January 6th of 2017. So, in his latest piece, Bob Dreyfus engages in quite a bit of speculation. But it's not empty speculation. It is based on new reporting from a Dutch newspaper that Dutch intelligence was able to penetrate Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, the hacking units of the Russian government based in Moscow. Now, that's a pretty critical breakthrough, but we have not seen this evidence. It is based on leaks to a Dutch newspaper, which is called De Volkskrant, and the sources they have are at the General Intelligence and Security Service of the Netherlands, and the acronym for it is AIVD. And they're reporting that back in 2014, the AIVD, shortly after the takedown of the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine, blamed on Russia, began really trying to hack deeply into Russian intelligence. And so this could have been the basis for the sketchy document that I referred to, the intelligence assessment that was released in early January, just 3 weeks before Trump was made president. And so I consider this informative, and I'm sharing it with you based on my pledge to follow the evidence. But let me read some of the language that my friend Bob Dreyfus uses. It's been widely reported for more than a year that the CIA, FBI, and NSA learned some of what they know from allied intelligence services. But we still haven't seen any evidence made public, and that has been my beef all along. Then he goes into conditional language. It seems plausible that if the Dutch had intel about Cozy Bear, they shared it with the CIA. We don't know that. This is his speculation. And it is plausible. There is quite a bit of intelligence sharing, and also they use other agencies to skirt domestic laws so that the CIA will spy for Britain and give that information to the British MI6, even though MI6 is not legally allowed to collect it itself. And we know that kind of back-scratching goes on quite a bit. So I'm not saying that his speculation is necessarily false. I'm only pointing out that it is speculation. A couple of sentences later, he says, as important as Russia's illegal social media campaign was, I don't think it was that important, Bob. It was the DNC Podesta hack, unproven, that led to nonstop headlines in the mainstream media, citing those hacked and then leaked emails from midsummer of 2016 right up to Election Day. And Dreyfus asserts Mueller's indictment of the 13 Russians proves beyond any doubt that he's not just looking at possible collusion with Russia or obstruction of justice by Team Trump, as crucial as those issues may prove to be. And here's something I completely agree with. He says all parties involved, including Mueller, the congressional committees, and the U.S. intelligence community itself, should start releasing the classified intelligence that pertains to Russiagate. No quibbles with that part. Then he describes that by hacking into Cozy Bear, the Dutch intelligence agency gained enormous amounts of live, real-time intelligence. Now, again, this is based on a news account that is based on leaks in Holland. So we're several steps removed from the actual sources of this. And he quotes the Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant. That's how the AIVD became witness to the Russian hackers harassing and penetrating the leaders of the Democratic Party, transferring thousands of emails and documents, and the AIVD hackers have seen it happening before their eyes. Now, we are told, again, without seeing any evidence, that AIVD hacked into the security cameras at the Russian offices near the Kremlin and even were able to view the security camera that showed who enters and exits the secure facility. So that could mean that there is information available on who these people actually are. And then back to the qualified statement, Dreyfus writes, if this report is accurate, and so far it hasn't been challenged, well, if is a really big if. He goes on to say, the report doesn't mean that the information shared with the United States by AIVD is the only source. That's accurate as speculation. If the underlying intelligence that went into the January 17 Intelligence Community Assessment is released, we'll learn a great deal more about what those other sources might have been. And this has been, again, my gripe all along, is that information hasn't been released, and it allows Bob Dreyfus to speculate just as it allows me to be skeptical. So this is quite a scene that we find ourselves in. Oh, and there's one more quote here from Dreyfus. One who may know a lot more than most of us since he prepared the 2017 intelligence assessment is James Clapper, President Obama's former director of national intelligence. And Bob, if you trust him, I'm sorry. He is a proven perjurer and a man with the means and the motive to help pull off a big smokescreen about Russiagate, if that is in fact what happened. In the show file for today's podcast, you'll find a link to Bob Dreyfus's story at The Nation magazine, as well as this one, kind of a counterpoint from Aaron Mate. His headline reads, Hyping the Mueller Indictment, and he notes that it offers nothing on the email hacking of the DNC and John Podesta, nor on the suspicions of Kremlin collusion that have engulfed Donald Trump's presidency. And like many, including Glenn Greenwald, and Thomas Frank, who I'm going to mention in just a moment, he notes the hysterical reaction to the indictments of 13 Russians who will never see the inside of a U.S. courtroom. And he quotes Jonathan Alter and Gerald Nadler and others, including Jim Risen, with these over-the-top reactions to the Mueller indictment. And he recites some of the facts here, that employees of the Internet Research Agency were allegedly instructed to foment political insensitivity through supporting radical groups, users dissatisfied with social and economic situation, and oppositional social movements. He reports the indictment discloses that the Internet Research Agency's activities were a part of Project Lakta, a larger Russian interference operation with a monthly budget of $1.25 million. Multiple outlets have reported this impressive figure and have failed to note that it was for the project's overall operations, which were sought to reach domestic audiences within the Russian Federation and others targeting foreign audiences in various countries, including the United States. So we always think that, we're number one and we're the focal point of everything, but the other aspect of this is that it's quite likely that the Internet Research Agency was trolling, clickbaiting, and generating revenue on ads that people saw on phony websites that they set up where the clickbaiters clicked through to. And Mate points out that fewer than a dozen of the Facebook ads that have been identified ran in Michigan and Wisconsin combined. The majority were seen fewer than 1,000 times. Purported Russian ad spending amounted to $1,900 in Wisconsin. All but $54 of that was during the primary. $823 was spent in Michigan and $300 in Pennsylvania. And he notes that the Russian-linked Facebook ads before the election amounts to 5/1,000ths of 1% of the $81 million spent on Facebook ads by the Clinton and Trump campaigns combined. And here's another way to put this in perspective. Newsfeed posts generated by suspected Russian accounts represented a tiny fraction of the overall content on Facebook, about 4,000ths, it's hard to say, thousandths of 1%, or approximately 1 out of 23,000 pieces of content. So this is hugely exaggerated. And when Bob Dreyfus uses it as a foundational element to jump to new speculation, I find that problematic. Back to Aaron Mate. He cites that Andrei Zakharov, one of the reporters who broke a story in the Russian media that detailed the efforts of the troll farm in St. Petersburg, now describes the factory's U.S.-focused operations as simply a very successful social media marketing campaign. And Mate underscores that by saying whatever it was not war, as many of the exaggerating voices have claimed in response to the Mueller indictment. And he quotes Max Blumenthal that the insight that at the heart of the Russian fraud is the embarrassing insight into American life that large numbers of Americans are ignorant. He said that insight very much applies to the well-educated coastal liberals who have made Russiagate their top political issue over the past year. In the service of a narrative to explain, and many hope reverse, Donald Trump's improbable victory, partisan thought leaders and credulous journalists have flooded the media landscape with a barrage of innuendo, supposition, and overblown claims. And I will add, much of that is based on leaks, anonymous sources, and evidence that we have never seen. And in closing, Mate says, for all of the worry about Russian meddling, the reaction to its latest known component serves as a reminder that the greater threats to democratic norms are perhaps much closer to home. And that kind of echoes an exchange I had with Aaron Mate in our podcast earlier this week. I hope if you haven't had a chance to listen yet, you will. As I mentioned, Thomas Frank, a friend of mine, he still owes me $5 for our bet on who would win the election of 2016. He also is commenting on the over-the-top reaction to the indictment. He does say, it's important to acknowledge that I believe Mueller's indictment is probably correct in its particulars, but no thanks to a new Cold War. Over at Consortium News, my friend Ray McGovern goes whimsical on us, and I've talked to Ray many, many times now, and he does have quite an impish sense of humor. So he was nominated by author Paul Craig Roberts to be director of the CIA, and so in preparing for his ascension to the top of the heap where he used to work, Ray McGovern writes a tongue-in-cheek column about what he would do on day one to get to the bottom of the Russiagate scandal. And it's, I think, quite interesting. My priority for day one is to hear both sides of the story regarding Russian hacking with all cards on the table. All cards. This means no questions are out of order, including what, if any, role the Steele dossier may have played in the preparation of the January 6, 2017 assessment. On the chance that the New York Times and other media might decide to play it straight, and that straight diverges from the prevailing Clapper-esque narrative of Russian perfidy, the various mainstream outlets will face a formidable problem of their own making. Mark Twain put it this way, it's easier to fool people than it is to convince them they have been fooled. And that's very well said. Rick Gates, who is Paul Manafort's number 2 in their international political consulting and money laundering operation, he has been waffling the last couple of days, and yesterday Mueller unsealed new indictments, more against Gates than Manafort, for tax evasion, bank fraud, and money laundering. And today Gates threw in the towel. He has decided not to fight this. That means he will cooperate with Mueller. And I want to note that Rachel Maddow did a great job on her show last night of exposing the desperate effort to generate cash that Manafort and Gates were engaged in at the time that Manafort approached Trump about serving without pay as his campaign manager. And there are many lingering questions. We have, partial information which suggests some bizarre behavior, and they are accused of pumping out as much as $75 million over the years from the offshore activities that they were engaged in. They lied to the IRS about not having foreign bank accounts, and there is now the allegation that Manafort dangled a bribe in front of the loan officer who did loan him $16 million in July of 2016, apparently on the promise that he would get a job at the Pentagon in a Trump administration. So this is fascinating. It shows the level of corruption of the people surrounding Trump. It shows that they tried to scam Trump. They were using him to elevate their positions, to try to dig themselves out of some kind of a huge debt. Now, maybe it was a blackmail situation. There are many possibilities here we don't know. But I want to be clear. The efforts to convict Manafort and Gates, I believe, will be successful. Gates stayed on the campaign after Manafort was fired. Gates was part of the transition. And so they may be able to turn their criminal behavior in terms of the money laundering, the banks, and the tax evasion into a witness who may have dirt on Trump. But it is too early for us to tell. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I see a couple of cancellations of people who've been supporting me for a long time. And I don't take that personally. People make their decisions about how to use their money. And I just appreciate people who do support me, including those who choose to cancel. So I won't single anybody out for abuse here. But I will thank Alice Carlson, Susan Lewis, Ethan Knox, and Eric Bohl. Eric just renewed his annual subscription, and I really appreciate that. So if you would like to become a new subscriber, I could use some new blood here. Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page, and you can easily choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. And if you prefer to avoid PayPal, you can communicate with me by the U.S. mail at Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. And by the way, Rafael is spelled R-A-F-A-E-L. Some people use a P-H. But if you get the zip code right, it'll reach me. Box 150-660, San Rafael, 94915. On his way to the CPAC conference this morning to bond with idiot conservatives, Trump announced that he is issuing harsh new shipping sanctions against the nation of North Korea. And this is calculated to give strength to his daughter Ivanka, who is attending the closing ceremonies of the Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, over the next couple of days. The new sanctions target 27 shipping companies, 28 vessels registered in North Korea, and 6 other countries, including China. And it's really unknown if these sanctions can be enforced because it would require interdiction on the high seas. And that could be treated by North Korea as an act of war, which could lead to an exchange that we don't want to trigger. But Trump loves the grandstanding and the threats and the bullying, and so there we are. He also, at CPAC, condemned the Florida sheriff's deputy who stayed outside of the Parkland School at Stoneman Douglas High School. He was the good guy with a gun, a deputy sheriff who was armed. But whether he just flipped out, had a yellow streak down his back, or decided that it was more strategic to try to catch a shooter as he exited, I don't know. But curiously, his name is Scott Peterson with one T. Scott Peterson is also the name of a man on death row at San Quentin, a mile from me here, who murdered his pregnant wife and tossed the body in San Francisco Bay. I never felt the trial proved his guilt, but I do believe he was responsible for that. Anyway, this other Scott Peterson was singled out by Trump. When it came time to get in there and do something, he didn't have the courage, or something happened, but he certainly did a poor job. He was there, the shooter, for 5 minutes. That was during the entire shooting. He heard it right from the beginning. Oh, well, wait a minute. This is about the deputy. He was there, I guess, outside he's referring to, for 5 minutes. That was during the entire shooting. He heard it right from the beginning, so he certainly did a poor job, but that's a case where somebody was outside, they're trained, and they didn't act properly under pressure, or they were a coward. Well, all of these are the issues that undermine Trump's claim that arming teachers and hardening our schools is going to prevent future mass shootings on school campuses. It's really just irrational. And Trump embraces it wholeheartedly because his idea is that you got to be proud when you're ignorant, and you just embrace it. And interesting piece at the Atlantic by a radiologist from Florida. Her name is Heather Schur, and she was at the hospital where some of the Parkland victims were brought, and she noted that she looked at a CT scan of one of the victims at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School who had been brought into the trauma center during her shift, and the organ looked like an overripe melon smashed by a sledgehammer with extensive bleeding. And she compares that to a typical gunshot wound from a pistol, from a 9mm automatic or semi-automatic handgun. And she notes that those bullets pass through an individual fairly cleanly, and that in a case where a gunman opened fire at a Fort Lauderdale airport with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, all six victims who arrived at the hospital survived. So she makes a critical point that the AR-15 is not only a semi-automatic rifle that can be used with a large magazine, but that the bullets come at a velocity that does an extreme amount of damage. They're not dum-dum bullets, but I guess the impact is similar. Florida Governor Rick Scott, a Republican, who has an eye on running for the U.S. Senate this fall, he's decided to break with the NRA. He is backing raising the minimum age to buy any firearm in Florida, not just semi-automatic rifles, to 21 from 18. He's also talking of $500 million for mental health and school safety programs. He wants one armed police officer for every 1,000 students at public schools. He doesn't support arming teachers, just turning the campuses into prison compounds. And it's the political scene in Florida and the aspirations of Rick Scott that I think make possible some modest changes in gun laws, at least in Florida. I think Trump is gaming the victims, and ultimately nothing serious will happen at the federal level. The governor of Missouri was indicted yesterday on a felony invasion of privacy charge. You know that Eric Greitens, who was a Navy SEAL, and he rose very quickly in politics in Missouri, and he has acknowledged that he had an extramarital affair in 2015, and he denies that he tried to blackmail the woman or that he took a nude photo of her without permission. But that is her allegation, and this has led to some charges that because when he took the photo, presumably with a phone, he then emailed it to a computer, and that makes the crime a felony rather than a misdemeanor. A big breakthrough at the New York Times in the Sunday magazine. They are featuring a nice detailed story entitled The Myth of the Hacker-Proof Voting Machine, written by Kim Zetter, who is the author of a book about cybersecurity. It is an honest look at the vulnerability of voting machines. This is something that I have been talking about, and I want to single out Brad Friedman of bradblog.com, the premier independent media outlet that covers election integrity in this country. And Brad has shown repeatedly that these are unverifiable electronic voting machines. In this article, Zetter outlines the vulnerabilities that many of these machines are equipped with modems to allow them to dial up a central tabulator on election night and spit out the results from that precinct, and that those modems can be hacked in reverse. And there are many other vulnerabilities that are exposed in this article. I've linked to it, and I hope you'll read it and also share it so that other people know about this. Bernie Sanders' only biological child, Levi Sanders, has announced he's actively considering running for Congress in the 1st District of New Hampshire. He's 48 years old. He said he'd run on Medicare for all, free college tuition. He said, the basic difference between me and my dad is I'm a vegetarian and he's not. But this has pissed off the Democrats there because there are already 7 Democrats running in the primary to succeed Democratic Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter, who is retiring. So they're hammering him as a carpetbagger because he doesn't live in the district. But everybody knows, at least everybody who cares to know, that it's not a requirement. You do not have to live in a district when you run for Congress, and you don't even have to live there if you're elected. Those are the rules. But it's often used as a political campaign ploy to denigrate the so-called carpetbagger. Want to recommend Lee Fung's latest investigative piece at The Intercept, where he shows that Purdue Pharmaceutical, the makers of OxyContin, have been donating money to a murky legal foundation that is trying to challenge the doctrine of corporate responsibility, and that corporate officials have personal liability for the actions of their corporation. And this is something that came up in my discussion with David K. Johnston yesterday about the Trump administration, about the efforts to take out regulations, and in particular installing people in cabinet agencies who then dismantle lawsuits or regulatory action against companies that they were involved with or working for just weeks before they took that action. So this is an interesting piece, and it exposes the Washington Legal Foundation that litigates in support of business interests. And they tried to get the Supreme Court interested in this, but apparently they didn't offer the justices enough OxyContin. And finally today, you remember that in the first week he was in office, Trump made all these phone calls and he violated protocol. He didn't get briefed first. He took calls from people out of order. It was a mess. And one of them was with the Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. And Turnbull was reminding him that Obama had promised to take in about 2,000 refugees who had been treated like hot potatoes by Australia. These were refugees who tried to get to Australia and instead were diverted to an island called Manus in Papua New Guinea. And one of the people who made that arduous trek was a Rohingya refugee from Myanmar, a young man who has now made it to Florida. And he is one of the refugees that Trump didn't want to take. He said they're all criminals and, it's Australia's fault. But this shows that despite the refugee ban and the travel ban, that some of these agreements are being kept, and a young man named Mahmoudal Hassan has a new life in Florida after a just devastating 4-year trek across Asia. Thanks for joining me for my daily news and comment podcast. We give it away free. You're free to share it. And you can find it on YouTube. Go ahead and subscribe there, will you, please? I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.